Hello, and welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Aarons, and today we're going to tackle an issue which gives most pianists a considerable amount of grief when they're in the process of refining their performance of a work by Mozart. Due to the transparency of his texture and the general lack of ornamentation in his melodic structure, Mozart's music can perhaps be best described as being outstandingly efficient, or borderline pure. But this means that when we create Mozart's music as a sound world, rather than the notes on a printed page, we're always going to face the unfortunate reality that the printed ideal may not necessarily create a sound ideal simply by playing it accurately. Granted, this is a problem in every composer, but with Mozart it's far more obvious than in others because of the lack of distractions for an audience. Today's episode will concentrate on a specific rhetorical device used by Mozart very frequently in his works, which exemplifies this issue of having to modify your playing style according to the resonance you're creating, solely to suit the purpose of a singular, though noteworthy, articulation. We'll use the first phrase from the opening movement of his A major sonata as an example. The 8-bar phrase is a typical construction of Mozart's style, and dividing it into two equal parts is likewise a typical Mozartian construct. These two parts complement and comment on each other. One way to think about it is that the first section asks a question, like this, and the second section answers the question like this. The most important parts are the ones that are different between the two sections. So, in other words, the last two bars of each. Let's focus on the first ending. One common way of interpreting this melody is to have it grow towards the middle of the phrase, and then taper off at the end. This follows the melody as it rises to the top and falls back down again. On the piano, it's always easier to grow or accumulate sound than it is to diminish sound in a controlled manner, and this case is no exception. We have the possibility of seemingly infinite growth when we start the phrase. We can do a controlled crescendo, or we can let the resonance grow in an uncontrolled manner, but we cannot come down from the plateau towards an infinite softness. Obviously, there's a point where the hammers do not hit the strings at all, but practically we only think of the point where it's too soft for an audience to hear. Experience informs us of this. In other words, I can come down from the top like this, but if I grade the decrescendo too steep, approaching infinite softness, we lose the sound completely. This limitation means that we must always aim for a general point regarding our dynamic or sound quality level when we're making a decrescendo, and this makes it far more difficult than if we were simply getting softer to an unknown or unplanned point. Let me explain. Limitations allow us to recognize when something is not refined, And therefore, when we are constructing our interpretation, we tend to recognize more of what is wrong with our own playing if we have parameters by which to judge our control of sound. Furthermore, sound and sound propagation are flexible parameters in the real world, being affected by everything from the piano to the humidity in the room, and therefore it becomes even more difficult and frustrating to have to aim for a specific sound point to be faithfully reproduced in any given performance environment. If we're growing sound, and we have the infinite growth in front of us in terms of dynamic level, then if we don't hit our point, we can easily adjust to this end situation. In other words, there are no consequences to us being imprecise. But if we're removing sound in a controlled manner, we don't have an infinite decay. We simply have the point of no return, which we have to stay above. And this means that if we overshoot this mark, we lose the sound and maybe our audience. The consequences are severe and noticeable, particularly in Mozart. The good news, however, is that if we train ourselves to aim for specific points everywhere, in growth and decay of sound, then we will be in more control of our sound in everything we play. And that's ideal. That's actually what piano technique truly is, the ability to control your sound in any circumstance. To go up and down in dynamic in a controlled manner for this phrase is relatively easy if you practice. The wild card to this situation is the last two-note slur. Due to the exposed nature of the texture and rhythmic expansion, the articulation of the slur becomes something that a listener is forced to pay attention to. And naturally, this means that we must perform this slur perfectly every time. Two-note slurs were used quite a lot in Baroque music as an expressive device, and this carries over into articulation traditions that we see in classical music. As an expressive gesture, this slur relies upon a few parameters. First, the basic rules of the slur must be observed regardless of what we do with it dynamically and temporally. The first note of the slur must be louder than the second. In fast rhythmic systems, the two-note slur can be easily played by simply emphasizing the first note and dropping the second dynamically. But in slower rhythmic systems like this one in Mozart, we must refine the decay of sound so that the second note of the slur emerges organically from the first. This requires a lot of careful listening. Consider for a moment how to play a note softer than the previous one. The resonance of the first note is set into motion, and depending on our sound production choices, we will have something between a long and a short decay. If we want to play a successive note softer than the first, we must gauge where in the decay the first note is resonating, and then play the second note softer than that resonance field. So, play the note, listen, and play the second just under the resonance. You can do this even if the first note is longer, but this also means that the decay will be further developed, and thus the second note will by necessity have to be even softer. The bottom line here is that creating a two-note slur is dependent on your ability as a pianist to gauge the resonance decay of the first note and play underneath it. Furthermore, a perfect two-note slur will be one where the second note emerges from the first in a seemingly natural, unhurried, and organic way. If the second note must be played earlier than the natural decline of sound, then we get something that sounds, for lack of a better word, jerky. This issue of rhythm combined with acoustic decay is actually a very severe problem when the starting dynamic of the phrase is set or within already established parameters, and this is the core of our discussion today. For a slur to sound organic and well constructed, it must be played according to the natural decay rate each individual instrument produces for the specific note. If a piano is well maintained, then this decay rate is relatively fixed for each note and thus predictable. If we were not constricted rhythmically and could play the second note of the slur at any time we wish, then we could play the second note along the natural decay rate without difficulty, and thus create a perfect slur, like in the previous example. However, in Mozart and in other composers, we're stuck with the rhythmic and tempo confines which can sometimes interfere with the natural decay rate that the instrument produces. Notes may seem to us to come too early in the decay, and thus we may get the jerky or hurried version. Because there may not be enough time for the sound to decay from the first note of the slur to the second, we have no choice in these situations but to artificially create a decay in order to make the slur work. This is difficult, and there are many different ways to do it. But it's this kind of detailed work that constitutes a performance of Mozart that can be considered to be refined. If I were to play this first section as is, except leave the slur open temporally, then I could play the second note of the slur when it sounds natural acoustically. This messes up the rhythm quite substantially. The second note of the slur clearly should be appearing sooner rhythmically. If we play it in time, the first note of the slur doesn't seem to have enough time to develop sonically before the second note is played. It's almost as if the second note interrupts the natural acoustic development of the first note's sound field. So, what I have to do is force a fast decay rate in the first note. This means playing it a little more percussively than I normally would. I'll play it first with a normal, rather rich sound production, and then I'll play it with a percussive sound production, so you can hear the difference. This problem only exists when we play Mozart on the modern instrument. The modern piano sound will have a rather lengthy natural decay rate when we compare it to the period instrument that Mozart would have been familiar with. Forte pianos have very quick decay rates, and thus this wouldn't even be an issue if I were using a Viennese forte piano. There are other methods, along with sound production control, which we use, of course. Cutting the damper pedal on the first note of the slur helps a great deal as well, because using it would elongate the development of the sound, and we don't want this. Here it is with pedal, and then without, for comparison. The last issue to think about is how we play the second note of the slur. The first note has to be a little more percussive to cut down the length of decay, but the second note needs added cushion to the sound so that it can appear to emerge from the resonant space. If I played the second note as percussive as the first, then we'd hear it more, like this. But if I played the second note in a very non-percussive way, then the slur sounds more natural. Before we move on, I'd like to pin down the ultimate problem of playing two-note slurs. It's all about trying to deal with a constricted timeline for the slur to occur, with the slur being dependent on the natural and unique properties of the instrument being used and the acoustic space being played in. In other words, the slur may work on a single temporal plane, but the rhythm enforced by the piece of music may be functioning on a temporal plane that is faster or slower than the slur. In practical terms, this means that there's a conflict of interest. You can practice to create the perfect slur all you want, but you have to adjust it to the hall and the instrument before or during performance. It's a very difficult challenge, and it's why a remarkable rendition of a piece by Mozart is so difficult to achieve, and so wondrous when we witness it. It's very easy to fail. The perfect slur, when liberated from the surrounding material, can be achieved with a little practice and experience. Our greatest challenge then comes when we are put into the situation I described at the very beginning. In the phrase that Mozart gives us, the slur happens to be at the end of the melody, which means that we cannot easily predict or choose what dynamic we are starting the actual slur with. When I talked earlier about overcompensating a decrescendo to end in infinite nothingness, it wasn't only because this is a universal concept that can be applied to any phrase, but because it has direct consequences when we have to set up a two-note slur at the end of this decrescendo. If I don't go high enough in dynamic before the slur, then there's not enough sound to make the slur work. Similarly, I could go very high in dynamic so that I have enough comfort room to make a natural slur work. The phrase may sound exaggerated, but at least I have enough space to decrescendo as much as I want. Obviously, neither solution is ideal. Usually, we're looking to create something in the middle, like this. There is a technique that I use in order to construct these situations to a point of reasonably reliable replicability in performance. The first step is to find a perfect slur within the rhythmic and tempo confines. Then, adjust it for the dynamic you want to end the phrase with. So, in this case, the slur starts a little softer and ends a little softer. This gives us the information we need to know about how to grow the phrase, because we now know how soft the slur is starting, and thus how far down we need to decrescendo from the climax. This gives us a minimum to get to. Even if we overshoot the top of the climax in terms of dynamics, making it too loud, we can still come back down. The only risk is that we don't crescendo enough to the climax, thus making everything too soft and risking the slur of either sticking out at the onset or losing the second note of the slur because it's all too soft. So, minimize your risk by planning ahead. Pretty simple, yeah? All of this planning and careful attention to detail serves to create a phrase that appears inevitable, organic, and most surprising of all, spontaneous. Reliably replicating this kind of detail in a performance requires the pianist to be very flexible when it comes to sound quality and dynamic control, and this is one reason why Mozart is so difficult. The other reason, which in my view tends to be forgotten, is that this kind of performance aesthetic requires an instrument that is completely reliable in terms of the response within the action. The less responsive a piano is to subtle variations of touch and dynamic, the more exaggerated the pianist must play in order for the effects to appear. So, that's it for this episode of Ask a Pianist. Until next time, keep practicing, and don't let yourself get too discouraged when you're refining your articulations in Mozart. It's difficult for everyone, even the professionals, but it's well worth the practice. Bye for now.